It is past 10 at night. The light in my home office is warm and low. It catches the edge of her coat. It catches the line of her jaw. It catches the very exact moment when she decides she is not going to leave. Dr. Vivian Cole is standing 3 feet away from me. I reach up and touch the side of her face. She goes completely still, not scared. Something older than scared. Something that has been waiting a long time. I say I am still angry about the 10 months. She says, I know. I say, I am also exactly where I want to be. The city is outside, the lamp is on. 10 months of very carefully built distance is standing between us in a room that is barely big enough to hold it, and something that has been holding itself together for a very long time finally has to break. If you want to hear the uncensored, too hot for YouTube version of this story, check out my Patreon link in the description. And if you are new here, tell me where you are watching from and please subscribe. It means everything. My name is Nadia Wells. I am 34 years old. I am the founder and owner of Wells & Co., a boutique event planning company. I started out of my second bedroom 6 years ago with one laptop, one client, and more confidence than I had any right to have. Today, Wells & Co. plans 30 to 40 high-end events a year, hospital galas, corporate anniversary dinners, private estate weddings that show up in magazines. I have a team of 11 people. I have a reputation in this city for making rooms feel like something, for making guests feel like the evening was built specifically for them. I have sat across tables from very difficult, very powerful people, and I have held my position. I have managed impossible timelines and impossible personalities and impossible catering disasters, and I have not broken. I am not, by any measure, a woman who lets things simply happen to her, and yet I had been letting Dr. Vivian Cole happen to me for 20 months, and I had not found a clean way to stop. We met because of a hospital, specifically because of the Hargrove Medical Center's annual charity gala, which was the most prestigious fundraising event in the city's medical community, and which had for 3 consecutive years been planned by an events company that had just dissolved in a very public and somewhat spectacular way 2 weeks before contract renewal season. I was the 3rd name on their shortlist. The first 2 were bigger firms. I did not expect to get the call. I got the call. The initial meeting was with the hospital's events committee. 4 people around a boardroom table. I presented for 20 minutes. It went well. They said they would be in touch. 3 days later, I got a second call. Not from the committee coordinator, from the chief medical officer's office. Dr. Vivian Cole wanted to meet. I had done my research, obviously. Everyone in the city knew who Vivian Cole was. Chief of cardiac surgery at Hargrove by 41. Chief medical officer by 44. She had rebuilt the hospital's surgical training program from the ground up. She had overseen the construction of their new cardiac wing. She had been on the cover of a regional business magazine under the headline, "The Woman Who Doesn't Lose." I walked into her office on a Thursday morning in October, expecting impressive and difficult. I was prepared for impressive and difficult. She was standing at the window when I came in. Her back was to me for the first 3 seconds. She was looking at the street below. Her office was on the 14th floor, and the morning light was coming in hard from the east, and she was just a silhouette against all that light. Then she turned around. She was in dark trousers and a pale gray blouse. Her hair was up in the kind of way that looks simple, but is actually the result of a very specific decision. She was not tall the way models are tall. She was tall the way certain women are tall. Like she had never once in her life considered making herself smaller for any room she was standing in. She looked at me, not at my portfolio, not at the presentation folder I was holding, at me, with the full, direct, unhurried attention of someone who had read everything available on you before you arrived and was now checking the gap between the information and the actual person. She said, "You're younger than your company history suggests." I said, "You ask sharper questions than your committee does." Something moved in her expression, not a smile, a small adjustment. like something had been confirmed. She said, "Tell me how you see the gala." I told her. I got the contract. Over the next 7 months, Dr. Cole was present at every major planning meeting. This was not the norm. Most executives at her level stayed removed from the logistics. They showed up for the final walkthrough and the event itself, and left the rest to the committee. Vivian showed up to every single review. She asked precise questions. She remembered details from previous meetings with the kind of accuracy that made my team occasionally nervous. She had opinions about things that clients at her level almost never have opinions about. The way a room transitions from cocktail hour to dinner, the logic of a seating arrangement, the relationship between the lighting at 10 p.m. and the lighting at midnight. She cared about how things felt, not just how they looked. That specificity was, I understand now, the first thing that undid me. She asked me to dinner in the 5th month, to align on the final quarter planning, which was a professional reason that was also, I suspected even then, not the whole reason. We talked about the gala for most of the dinner, and then, for about an hour at the end of the evening, we did not talk about the gala. We talked about other things, about the city and the way it was changing, about the restaurant's design, which I had opinions about, and she had opinions about, and our opinions were different in interesting ways, about what it felt like to build something from nothing, and then look at it and not quite recognize yourself in it anymore. That hour had a quality I had not experienced in a professional dinner in 6 years of running my company. I sat in my car for 15 minutes after I got home and did not start the engine. She kissed me on a Tuesday evening outside a parking garage while we were both still holding our phones, like we were going to say goodbye, professionally. It was brief and certain and had no apology anywhere in it. When she stepped back, she said, "I have been not doing that for 3 months." I said, "You should have done it 3 months ago." She looked at me the way you look at someone when you are standing at the far end of a decision you already made, and you are just now showing them the view. We got married 9 months later. The first several months of our marriage were extraordinary in the specific way that comes from being inside the complete undivided attention of another person. Vivienne paid attention the way surgeons pay attention, totally, precisely, with the kind of focus that made you feel like you were the most specific and important thing in the room. She remembered everything. She remembered what I said about a vendor problem on a Monday and asked about it on a Thursday. She appeared in the doorway of my home office during late nights not to interrupt, but just to put a glass of water on my desk and stand there for 30 seconds and then leave. She texted during the middle of her surgical days. Not long messages, just 2 words. "Thinking of you." Or, "How's the Hargrove redesign coming?" Just enough to say, "I am aware you exist, even when I am doing the other most important thing in my life." I had never in my life felt so entirely chosen. And then, around the 5th month of the marriage, something changed. I want to be careful about how I say this, because easy words do not do it justice. She did not leave. She was still there every morning at the kitchen table, still there every night, still at my side, at every event we attended together. She still said good morning and good night, and she still asked about my work, and she still came to bed at the end of every day. What changed was the quality of it. The attention was still there, but it had become managed, careful, like she was monitoring the temperature between us with a precise instrument and making adjustments when it got above a certain level, like there was a dial she was keeping at a specific setting, and she had decided what that setting was, and she was committed to maintaining it. Not cold, not cruel, just controlled. I spent 3 months assuming it would pass, like weather. I spent 3 more months trying to understand what had shifted. I spent 4 months in the particular exhaustion of living alongside the edge of something I needed, watching for the moments when the real Vivienne showed through the surface of the managed version. Those moments existed. I was not imagining them. There was a morning in November when I came into the kitchen in yesterday's clothes, because I had been working until 2 a.m., and Vivienne was at the counter with her coffee. She looked up, and in the half-second before she put her expression in order, I saw something on her face that was not managed and not professional, and was not the careful warmth she had been producing for months. I cannot name what it was exactly. It had something to do with the way people look at things they have been missing and have not let themselves miss. Out loud, she said, "Good morning." She slid my coffee toward me without being asked. The expression was gone. There was an evening at a hospital board dinner when a colleague, Dr. Marcus Reed, had been standing beside me at the drinks table for what was becoming a noticeable amount of time. He was charming in the way that some people are charming by proximity. I looked across the room, looking for an excuse to move. I found Vivienne's eyes on him, with an expression that had nothing composed about it, nothing professional. She looked away immediately when she saw me looking. The expression was gone so fast, I spent the rest of the dinner deciding I had made it up. I had not made it up. I lived alongside those edges for 4 months, and told myself they were enough. They were not enough. The gala I need to tell you about is the Mercy Children's Hospital annual fundraiser. It was organized by Diane Park, one of my oldest clients, and a genuine force of nature. She ran the charity events committee with the focus of someone who has made a cause deeply personal because she had. Her youngest son had been treated at Mercy Children's when he was 6 years old, and she had never stopped being grateful. Diane had called me in January to ask if I would participate in a charity experience auction at the March Gala, not planning it, participating in it. The format was simple. 10 people from the city's professional community would offer an experience, a dinner, a tour, an afternoon doing what they did best. Guests would bid at the gala. The money went to the hospital. January, Nadia had said yes, because the cause was real, because Diane was one of my closest friends, because I could generate real bidding interest in these circles, and the discomfort of standing on a small stage while people bid on an evening of my company seemed like a manageable price to pay. March, Nadia had a more complicated relationship with the commitment, but I had given my word, and the explanation for backing out would have required saying things out loud that I was not ready to say out loud. I told Vivian about it in February, a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table. I said Diane's charity gala is the 15th. I am in the experience auction. I agreed in January. She set down her coffee cup. She said, "An experience auction," I said. "A charity experience auction. For Mercy Children's Hospital. The winner gets a dinner and a full behind-the-scenes tour of a large-scale event setup. I walk them through the whole process." She looked at the table, not at me. "At the table," she said, "and other people are bidding," I said. "That is the definition of an auction," she said. "And you agreed to this in January," I said. "Yes." A pause. 3 seconds exactly. I counted them. She said, "Fine." She picked up her coffee. The conversation ended. I thought about the word fine for 5 days. Fine was not her word. Fine was what people said, when the real word was something they had decided they had no right to say. I turned fine over and over in my mind, and I said nothing, and I did nothing with it. Which was, I can see now with the clear eyes of someone looking backward, the exact same mistake Vivienne had been making for 9 months. The night of the gala, I wore deep green, a dress my assistant, Lena, had been trying to get me to wear since my birthday, heels, my mother's pearl earrings. Lena met me outside the ballroom entrance. She was in burgundy and running on pure organized excitement, which was her natural state at big events. She looked at me and said, "You look like you belong on the stage," which was her way of saying she was rooting for me without actually saying it. Vivian had a surgical conference dinner that same evening. Prior commitment. Monthly department heads meeting that predated the marriage. She would come late if she could manage it, she said. I said that was fine. I heard the word in my own mouth, and I did not go looking at it. The evening was good. I was genuinely present in it, in a way I had not been at social events recently. I had been moving through my public life on a kind of surface setting for months, and I had almost forgotten what it felt like to actually be in a room. Lena appeared at my elbow at 9:15 with a sparkling water, and the expression she wore when she was deciding how to tell me something. She said, "She's here." I went still. Lena said, "She got here maybe 8 minutes ago, back right, near the stage entrance. She's not in the conference dinner clothes." I processed this. I said, "She changed." Lena said, "She must have gone home first. She's in that dark jacket, the one she wears when she thinks an evening is going to matter." The surgical conference dinner had ended. She had driven home. She had changed out of her formal clothes. She had looked at her options, and she had made a deliberate choice about where to go next. I turned around. Vivian was at the back right of the ballroom. Dark jacket, dark trousers, the slim professional look she chose for evenings she considered important. Her hair was up in its controlled configuration, but from across the room I could see that one piece had come loose. One small piece near her right ear, catching the light when she moved. She had gone home, changed, and come here, and she was slightly imperfect, which meant she had not taken the time she usually took. She had a glass of wine she had not yet raised to her mouth. She was looking at me, not the managed version of her attention, the full version, the original version, the kind that made you feel like you were the only specific thing in the room. When she saw me turn, she lifted her glass slightly, not a toast, an acknowledgement. I nodded. She turned back to the group of people beside her with the smooth, practiced ease of someone who had been moving through professional rooms her entire adult life. Lena said quietly, beside me, "Something is about to happen." I said, "Nothing is going to happen. I just need to get through the auction." Lena looked at me with the patient, affectionate attention of someone who has been watching an inevitable thing approach for 10 months and is now watching it arrive. The auction began at 9:45. Diane took the microphone with the practiced ease of a woman who had explained this cause to rooms full of wealthy people for 7 years. The auctioneer knew his job. The escalating performance of public generosity, the social pressure of being seen to win, 10 experiences up for auction, a chef's private dinner, a wine cellar tour, a morning with an architect, a behind-the-scenes day at a magazine, and others. I was 8th. I spent the first 7 items in the kind of physical alertness that my body produces when it is waiting for something uncomfortable. Not quite dread. More like a very sharp awareness of everything in the room. My name was called. I walked to the marked spot on the stage platform and stood in the lights while the auctioneer described my company and my work in the generous, slightly inflated way that charity auctioneers always do, and the bidding opened at $2,000. A man at a center table, Gregory Vance, raised his paddle immediately. Gregory bid at every charity event in the city. It was essentially his public personality, 2,500. The 3,000 from the left side. Gregory at 3,500. A woman near the back at 4,000 gave me a brief. Warm feeling, 5,000 from a man 2 tables forward I did not recognize. Then 6, then 6,500, Gregory at 7, the unknown man at 7,500. The auctioneer was building towards something, and I was standing in the light thinking about nothing in particular, because nothing in particular was available to think about in the specific suspended state of being stood up in a room full of witnesses while people decide what your company is worth. And then the room changed. I have worked enough large events to know when a room changes. It is not a sound, it is a shift in the quality of attention, a collective reorientation, like 200 people all becoming aware of the same thing at the same time, without anyone calling it out loud. The shift moved through the ballroom from the back right toward the front. Quiet, unmistakable. I looked toward the back right of the room. Vivian had left her group. She was crossing the floor. I will tell you honestly what happened to my body in that moment. My heart did something it had not done in 10 months. Not the managed flutter of being near her, that I had learned to control. The full thing, the original thing, the thing that had happened the first time she turned from her office window. With the morning light behind her, she was walking with the walk I had spent 20 months memorizing, contained, deliberate, not fast and not slow, the walk of someone who has made a decision and is carrying it out without any remaining question about whether it was the right one. She had removed her jacket at some point. She was in the grey blouse, the blouse I knew, and her hair still had that one loose piece near her ear, catching the ballroom light every time she moved. She stopped at a table 4 rows from the front. A man was sitting there with a bidding paddle he had not yet used. She said something to him. He looked at her. He looked at me on the stage. He handed her the paddle. The auctioneer said, "Excellent. We have a new bidder joining us. Do I see 10,000?" Vivienne raised the paddle. 200 people made a sound. Not loud, completely unmistakable. The collective sharp intake of a room that has just understood that what it is, watching is not charity theater anymore. It is something else entirely. Gregory Vance looked at Vivienne for about 3 seconds with the expression of a man doing a very fast and very accurate set of calculations. He set his paddle down. He almost smiled. He did not bid again. 12,000 from the unknown man. Vivienne raised the paddle without looking at him. 15. Paddle up immediately. 18 from the back. Paddle up, without blinking. 20. 22 from the back. The auctioneer was working very hard to keep his composure. 25? Vivienne raised the paddle. The man at the back paused. He looked at Vivienne. He looked at me on the stage. He was a reader of rooms, this man, and he was reading this one accurately. He set his paddle on the table. The auctioneer said, $25,000. Do I hear 26? Going once, going twice. He paused 1 beat longer. Sold. The ballroom applauded with the particular warmth of a crowd that has just watched something it did not plan for and will be talking about for the next 6 months. Vivienne set the paddle down on the table beside her in one clean, unhurried motion. Then she turned and crossed the remaining distance to where I was standing in the light. She was close. In the state I had not seen her in for 10 months. The full beam, undivided, unmanaged, aimed at me with the full weight of whatever she actually was. Her jaw was set in the way it was set when she had made a decision and was already living on the other side of it, and was not interested in making the decision smaller. She took my hand, not dramatically, not as a performance, just the way she had always taken my hand in the early months, like it was the natural extension of being near me, like it was the obvious thing to do. She walked me to my table. She sat in my lap. There was a moment of complete suspended silence in that ballroom. Then she turned her head and pressed her mouth against my temple. Just the warmth of her lips against my skin. I felt her breath. And then she said one word against my hair, very quietly, in the private register she used when a thing was meant only for me. She said, "Mine." And then she sat up very straight and looked at the room. It was not a performance smile. Vivienne did not perform. She had a public face and a private one, and the face she gave that room was the private one, the one that appeared when she had done something she believed was correct and was feeling the specific, quiet satisfaction of being correct. The room applauded again, louder, warmer. Lena was somewhere to my left. I could not afford to look at her directly. What I was most aware of was the quality of Vivienne's stillness, not the professional stillness she carried into every meeting and every difficult conversation. That one belonged to the hospital and the boardroom and the press of other people's expectations. This was different. The stillness of someone who had stopped calculating and was simply here, her shoulder against mine, the room warm and full, and I was inside the full beam of her attention for the first time in 10 months. I did not know how to hold the weight of that, except carefully and without looking away, I said, against the side of her head, quietly enough to be private in a room that was no longer private. "What are you doing?" she said, just as quietly. "Being obvious." I said, "You are never obvious," she said. "I know, That has been a problem. The auction ended. The evening moved into its final hour. Vivian stayed exactly where she was for 40 minutes. She spoke to people who came to our table with the composed, specific attention she brought to every required social situation. She was interesting and warm in the way she chose to be when she decided to fully turn it on, but she did not move from my lap. I sat in the middle of all of it, the candlelight, the crowd, the noise, the warmth, and felt something I needed to examine in a room without 200 witnesses. I was glad. I was furious. I had needed this for 10 months, and she had chosen tonight, in this venue, with this audience, to finally give it to me. And I did not yet know the full shape of why, and the why was going to cost us something when we were alone. We left at 11. Her car was outside. She had told her driver when to be there, which meant she had planned the exit, which meant the evening had been more deliberate than I had been processing in real time. The back seat of the car was the specific silence of two people who have agreed without words that the necessary conversation cannot happen in a moving vehicle with another person in it. I looked at the city through my window. She looked at hers. After a few minutes, she said, "I was in the conference dinner when Lena texted me that the auction was starting." I looked at her profile. She said, "The agenda still had 40 minutes left." I excused myself. I told the table I had to be somewhere. I said, "And what did Dr. Harmon say?" He was her department head. A formal man, she said. He said nothing. He looked at me and said nothing. I think he understood exactly where I was going. The car reached our building. The elevator was the kind of silence that has physical weight. The apartment was the way we had left it that morning. Clean and organized and specific. The home of two people with strong opinions about how a space should feel, who had built something exact and livable together. I set my bag on the counter. I stepped out of my shoes. I stood in the kitchen in the green dress under the warm overhead light, and I looked at her. She was still in her blouse, standing on the other side of the kitchen island with her hands loose at her sides, and her face in the configuration she wore when she was holding something tightly and knew that the holding was visible. I said, "Talk to me." She said, "I know." I said, "That is not talking." She moved her eyes to the kitchen window, and then back to me. Something in her expression was bending at the thinner places, not breaking, just showing the cost of holding itself together for a long time. She said, "I watched you walk up to that stage. I told myself it was a charity event, and that I was a rational person, and that whatever happened in that auction was harmless." I waited, she said, "and then Gregory Vance raised his paddle." I said, "Gregory Vance raises his paddle at every charity event in the city. That is his whole thing," she said. I know. I knew that in the moment. It made no difference at all. The kitchen was quiet around us. The city outside had gone to its late-night register, low and continuous, a far-off sound of machinery and distance. Vivienne was very still, managing the gap between what was happening inside her and what she was willing to show on the surface. I said, "Tell me what you actually did." She said, "I found the most available paddle in the room, and I spent $25,000 at a charity auction for my own wife." I said, "For the wife you have not properly touched in 10 months." A silence long enough that I could hear the refrigerator hum. She said, "Yes," I said. "Vivienne," she said. "Yes," I said. "I am not asking you to explain the $25,000. I am asking you to explain the 10 months." She looked at her hands, at the island surface. Back at me, 3 points of focus in 4 seconds, which was, for Vivienne Cole, a remarkable amount of visible movement. She said, "I don't know how to say all of it correctly tonight." I said, "I am not asking for all of it correctly. I am asking for something true." She reached up and pulled the loose piece of hair behind her ear, and then she pulled the whole thing down. All of it. She set the pin on the counter. With her hair down, the controlled version gone, she looked the way she looked in early mornings before the day required her to be Dr. Cole, and the sight of it did something to my chest that I was not going to pretend was not happening. She said, "In November, at the board dinner, Doctor. Reed was standing beside you at the drinks table for a long time, and I was across the room, and I felt something I had told myself I had no right to feel. I said, "Nothing happened with Marcus Reed," she said. "I know nothing happened with Marcus Reed. That is not what I am telling you," I said. "Then what are you telling me?" she said. "I am telling you what I felt and what I did with it, which was nothing. I had built the distance. The distance was my own construction, and the consequences were mine to carry. And I carried them privately, which is what I have been doing for 10 months. And tonight I walked out of a conference dinner, and I appear to have stopped. I said, 'Walk me through why you built the distance.' A pause longer than all the others. She was deciding how much truth fit in this kitchen on this night. She said, 'Because I was afraid of the size of what I had already given you, and I did not know what to do with that fear, and the only tool I trusted was distance.' She said it plainly, without softening it, without wrapping it in professional language, just the sentence, bare and honest and smaller than every other sentence she had given me in 10 months. 'I am afraid of the size of what I have given you.' I stood in my green dress in the kitchen light and looked at my wife, my cold, precise, brilliant wife, who had spent $25,000 on her own wife and sat in her lap in a room full of 200 witnesses and said, 'Mine against my hair,' like it was the only word she had for the truth, who was now standing across a kitchen island telling me she had been afraid of the size of what she felt and had retreated into the only architecture she fully trusted. I was not made soft by this. I need to be precise about that. The 10 months were not dissolved by the quality of her honesty in this moment. The absence had been real, the managed warmth, and the careful maintenance of a minimum distance, and the evenings that had been almost enough, and exactly not enough. Those had cost me something real, and that cost was not cancelled by one paddle and one honest kitchen conversation at midnight. But I was shaken by it, which is different. I said, 'I am going to sleep.' She said nothing. I said, 'We are not done with this conversation.' She said, 'I know.' I said, 'Tomorrow morning, with coffee, the actual version. Not the version where you give me the most you think I can handle at one time.' She looked at me across the kitchen island for one long moment, with the full beam fully on. The real thing, unmanaged and complete. Like she had finally stopped deciding how much of it I was permitted to receive. She said, 'Yes!' I walked toward the bedroom door. At the door, I stopped. I said, 'You did something tonight that I have needed from you for 10 months. I want you to know I received it.' I heard her breathe. I said, 'I am still holding you accountable for the 10 months. One paddle does not make them disappear.' She said, 'I know.' I said, 'Good night.' 'Vivienne,' she said. 'Good night, Nadia.' I went to bed. I lay in the dark and listened to the apartment reorganize itself around her. The kitchen light going off after 20 minutes. The soft, careful sound of her moving through the space with the contained quiet I had been sleeping beside for 20 months. The soft click of the guest room door. Not the bedroom. The guest room. She was giving me the space. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about the word mine set against my temple in a room full of witnesses. I thought about the way she had crossed that floor. Not fast, not dramatic, just certain, the walk of someone who has made a decision and is following it all the way through, with no remaining questions. I thought about the first meeting in her office, with the morning light behind her, the parking garage where I sat for 15 minutes without starting my car, the 9 months between a Tuesday evening outside a parking garage and a wedding. I thought about fear, about the size of a feeling, about what a person does when the size of it frightens them. I had felt that fear too, in the early months, and I had decided toward it. I had decided toward it, and then watched her decide differently. For 10 months from a distance, she had built entirely herself. I thought about tomorrow morning, the coffee she would make exactly right without being asked. The actual version she had promised, the one that would require both of us to stand in a kitchen without armor and find out what was left when the management was finally gone. I thought about the loose piece of hair in the ballroom light, the way she had walked toward me anyway, certain and deliberate and entirely visible to every person in that room. Mine. I thought about it until the city went quiet, and then I thought about it a while longer. She was already awake when I opened my eyes. I knew it the way you know things about a person after 20 months of sleeping beside them. Not by sound, not by movement, by the different quality of the air in the apartment when it is occupied differently than it was when you fell asleep. The guest room door was open. The kitchen light was on. I lay in the gray blue of early morning for a moment. She was at the kitchen island in a white shirt and dark trousers, not yet the full professional version, the version that existed before the day formally began. Her hair was down, not styled, just down, the way it was on mornings before the day required her to be Dr. Cole, a mug of coffee in her hands, another on the counter on my side of the island, still hot. She had timed it. She looked up when I came in. Her face in the morning was always more legible than her face at any other time of day. The full professional armor had not yet been applied. What you saw before 8 in the morning was the actual structure of her face without the layer of management over it. This morning the structure of her face was afraid, not performing afraid, just afraid. I sat down. I picked up the coffee. I held it with both hands. She said, "You slept?" I said, "So." She looked at her mug. She said, "I have been thinking about what the actual version requires." I said, "I am listening." She was quiet for a moment. The city outside was at its early morning sound, not silence, a lower, more honest noise. A pigeon on the window ledge made a brief complaint and left. She said, "There was someone before you, 7 years ago, when I was 38. Her name was Joanna. She was a research fellow at a hospital I was consulting at for 3 months. She was funny and specific, and she was the first person I had ever fully let into the structure of myself." She set her mug down, looked at it, by which I mean I showed her the parts I did not show anyone else. The things that ran without maintenance, and the things that required a lot of maintenance, and the things that were, if I am going to be honest, in some real disrepair from a long time of not being examined. She said, she ended it after about a year and a half. She was not a bad person. She left because she took a position in another country, and the relationship had not reached the stage where either of us had said the words that would have made rearranging our lives feel obvious. Or perhaps she had decided it was not worth rearranging hers. "I was not entirely certain at the time, and I am less certain now," she said. "What I was very certain of was the cost, not the leaving itself, the aftermath, the specific experience of having made yourself fully available to someone, and then having that person become unavailable, and realizing that the vulnerability had been real, and that the cost of the vulnerability was real, and that I could not undo either one." I said, "So you stopped," she said. "Not immediately. It took time. But yes. I built a particular structure around that part of myself, and I kept it in good repair for 6 years, and I believed I was functional." I said, "And then you turned from a window." She looked at me. She said, "And then you said my committee asks easier questions than I do." I held the coffee. She said, "I want to be precise because you asked for the actual version, and the actual version requires precision." She said, "When I asked you to dinner in the 5th month of planning that gala, I had been making arguments to myself for 3 months about why it was not a good idea. They were solid arguments, professional ethics, power dynamics, the honest awareness that I was not after Joanna, the person I had been before Joanna." She said, "But every one of those arguments was a conclusion I had already reached, and was now building furniture around." She said, "I was in love with you, Nadia. I had been for months. The arguments were not the reason I waited. The arguments were what I was doing while I waited." The kitchen was completely still. I said, "You knew before the dinner?" She said, "I knew before the first dinner." I said, "You kissed me outside a parking garage like it was already settled." She said, "It was. That is what I am telling you. The decision was made before the dinner." I spent 1 month arguing with it, then I stopped arguing. I sat with the weight of that, with the understanding that she had walked into those dinners, and into that parking garage, and into the 9 months that ended in a wedding, with the full knowledge of exactly what she was doing, and exactly what it was going to cost her if the cost ever came due. I said, "And 5 months into the marriage, you decided the cost was arriving," she said. "I decided I had given you everything I had refused to give anyone after Joanna, and that the size of it was visible from the inside, and that the visibility frightened me. Not because I doubted you. I want to be very precise about that. Not because I had any reason to believe you would leave or be careless with what I had given you. It was not a rational fear. It was much older than rational," I said. "So you did to me what was done to you." She said it immediately. Yes. No softening, no qualifier. Just the word. Flat and honest and absorbing the full weight of what it meant. I said, "You built a distance from the thing you were afraid of losing and called it being professional." She said, "Yes." I said, "And the 10 months were not about me." She said, "No, they were entirely about me. You were the person I was protecting myself from, and you were also the person who most deserved the thing I was protecting myself from losing." I knew that the entire time. Knowing it correctly did not stop me from continuing. I held my coffee and looked at my wife. The morning version of her here in the apartment before the city needed her to be Dr. Vivian Cole. Here with her hair down and both hands around a mug and the actual structure of her face visible for the first time in 10 months. She had just told me she had been in love with me since the 5th month of a professional project. 7 years after someone named Joanna had taught her what full vulnerability cost, she had told me plainly, without managing the delivery, without presenting the version most likely to produce a specific outcome. She was telling me the actual version. I said, "Thank you." She blinked. I said, "Not for the information, for saying it plainly." She nodded once. Slowly, I said, "I am not done being angry about the 10 months." She said, "I know," I said. "The anger is accurate. You built a distance that cost me something real, and it cost me something real every single day. One morning with coffee does not retire that debt." She said, "I know. I am not asking you to retire it." I said, "What are you asking for?" She said, "Permission to continue the conversation, not to resolve everything right now, just to keep going." I looked at her. The early light was coming through the kitchen window, the gray-white of a city morning starting, and it was doing something useful to the space between us, making it smaller, the way honest things in morning light make distances smaller. I said, "Continue the conversation," she said. "Yes," I said, "the actual version, not the managed one." She said, "Yes." I stood and went to the sink. I rinsed my mug and set it on the rack. I turned around. She was still at the island, watching me, the full beam doing what it always did, making the thing it was pointed at feel like the only specific thing in the world. I said, "I have a sight walk at 10. I will be back by 2. She said, "I will be here." I went to get ready. At the bathroom door, I stopped. I said, "The coffee was right." She said nothing. I said, "It has always been right. I want you to know I know that." I went to get ready. Behind me, in the kitchen, she was quiet for a long time. Lena was at the office when I got back. She was working on a run sheet for the following week. She looked up when I came in. She had the expression she wore when she had been thinking about something all morning and was deciding how to introduce it. She said, "Someone filmed the auction." I said, "Someone always films the auction." She said, "Someone filmed the moment she crossed the floor. It has been shared since last night. It is still going." I held out my hand. She turned her phone toward me. The video was 47 seconds, filmed at a slight angle from about 5 tables back, the ballroom light doing its warm, flattering work. You could see me on the stage. You could see the auctioneer. And then, from the back of the frame, Vivian entered the shot. I had been inside that moment. I had understood it from the inside. I had not understood it from the outside. From the outside, it was unmistakable. She moved the way she moved when she had made a decision before entering a room and was simply following it through. She stopped at the table. She took the paddle. She bid. She outbid the room with the flat, unhurried certainty of someone who had not entertained the possibility of a different outcome. She set the paddle down. She walked to the chair. She sat in my lap. You could not hear the one word from that angle, but you could see her mouth move, and you could see what happened to my face in the half-second after. The very specific thing that happened to my face before I had the chance to rebuild my expression. I handed the phone back. Lena said, "About 6,000 shares as of an hour ago." I said, "People saying," she said. "Things like, I want this, and this is the only love story I believe in, and..." She walked across that entire ballroom without breaking stride. "Please teach me." I sat with that. Lena said, "A journalist from the Tribune City section called this morning. She would like a comment about the evening." I looked at Lena. She said, "I told her I would pass it along." I called Vivian at noon. She answered on the second ring. Vivian always answered professional calls immediately and answered my calls on the third or fourth ring. The second ring meant she had been waiting. I said, "The video." She said, "I know." I said, 6,000 shares. She said, "More now. Priya has been tracking it." I said, "There is a journalist from the Tribune." A brief pause. She said, "I know. She called my office as well. Priya fielded it." I said, "What did Priya say?" She said, "Priya said Dr. Cole would consider a response." I said, "What does Dr. Cole want to do?" A longer pause. She said, "Dr. Cole is deciding whether her instinct to manage the narrative is something she should act on or something she should override." I said, "Which way is she leaning?" She said, "I am leaning toward calling the journalist back myself. Personally," I said. "And telling her what?" She said, "The accurate version of what happened. I spent 10 months managing what I felt about you from the inside. I do not intend to spend the next 10 months managing it from the outside." I said, "Say that last part again." She said it again. Slower, I said, "Call the journalist." She said, "Yes." She called me back 2 hours later. She said, "I told the journalist that I am very much in love with my wife, and I make no apologies for making that visible in public." I told her that Mercy Children's Hospital had a record fundraising night, and she should write about that too. I sat in my office with the phone against my ear. I said, "How did the journalist respond?" She said, "She seemed very pleased. I believe she said it was the best quote she had received in several months." I said, "I believe that." A pause. She said, "Nadia." I said, "Yes." She said, "I will be home at 6 if you want to continue the conversation." I said, "I will be there." She said, "I will make dinner." I said, "You do not make dinner." She said, "I am entirely capable of making dinner. I choose not to as a general rule, because you are better at it, and I find it unnecessary to do things in an inferior way when a superior option is available." I said, "That is the most Vivian sentence you have ever said to me." I heard the corner of her voice do something. She said, "I will see you at 6. She arrived at 6:20. Traffic. She said it twice as though the first time had not been complete. The kitchen smelled like the pasta dish I had taught her in the 3rd month of the marriage, during the period when she had decided that learning to cook one thing properly was a reasonable use of her focus. She had learned it with the same directed efficiency she brought to everything, and it was genuinely good. We ate at the kitchen island. The evening light was on. The city came through the windows at its early evening frequency, and we talked. Not about logistics, not about the schedule, about things, about the video and the journalist's piece that would run on Friday, about the specific strange feeling of having a private thing become public before you had finished understanding it yourself, about a hospital expansion project she was uncertain about an event I had been building for 3 months that kept resisting a key logistical problem. She said, "The auction decision. I want to tell you something about it." I said, "Tell me." She said, "It was not as deliberate as it looked from the outside." I said, "It looked very deliberate." She said, "The execution was deliberate. The decision, I am not certain I made it consciously. I was standing at the back of that room, and I watched Gregory Vance raise his paddle, and something that had been managed for 10 months stopped being manageable. The specific thought I had was, if I stay at the back of this room, I will spend the rest of my life at the back of this room. The kitchen light was warm. The pasta was between us on plates. The apartment was the way it was when we were both in it. Organized, specific, the home of two people who had built something together that was worth accounting for. I said, "You had already decided before you crossed the floor." She said, "Yes," I said. "I knew that when I saw you were there, you had changed your clothes, you had driven home, you had changed and come back. A person does not do those things and then stand at the back of the room being managed." She said, "No," I said. "You had decided in the elevator." She said, "Yes, I think so." I was standing in the elevator looking at the button for our floor, and I thought about staying at the back of the room. And I thought, "No," I said. "Just no," she said, "just no." I looked at her, the woman who had shown me the full beam of her attention in a parking garage on a Tuesday evening, and then spent 5 months slowly pulling it back, and 5 months more maintaining a specific minimum, who had been afraid of the size of what she had given, and had done the only thing she knew to do, with fear, which was to build a careful structure around it, and call the structure professionalism. I said, "I have been angry for 10 months. She said, "I know." I said, "I am still angry." She said, "I know." I said, "I am also glad you crossed the floor." She said nothing, but something in her face opened slightly, the way faces open when they have been braced for something that did not arrive. I said, "Both things are true at the same time." "I need you to understand that," she said. "Yes," I said. "The actual version is going to require more than 2 conversations." She said, "I know." I said, "It is going to require you to stop going quiet when what you are carrying gets too heavy." She said, "Yes," I said. "When it starts to feel like too much, when the size of it gets uncomfortable, I need you to say that." Instead of disappearing into the guest room, she held my gaze for a long moment. She said, "That is going to be difficult." I said, "I know what kind of difficult it is." She said, "It is not difficult the way a complex medical problem is difficult. It is difficult the way things that frighten you are difficult." I said, "I know. I am not asking you to stop being afraid of it. I am asking you to tell me when you are, instead of building a door for it and locking it." She absorbed that the way. She absorbed accurate things, without deflecting them, without making the landing softer, just letting them arrive. She said, "I will try," I said. "That is what I am asking for, not the finished version, just the attempt." She said, "Yes." We did the dishes together, something we had done in the early months, and had let go of somewhere in the middle of the distance. It was small and ordinary, and the silence while we did it was the old kind, the kind from before the management, inhabited instead of maintained. When the kitchen was clean, she reached across the counter and took my hand, briefly, the weight of it, and then she let go. I let her let go. Neither of us said anything about it. It was not the kind of thing that needed words. She went to the bedroom that night, not the guest room. I lay in the dark beside the presence of her, and thought about the cost of honest things, and what it felt like to begin to account for them. The journalist's piece ran on Friday. It was what Lena had predicted. A love story. 1 paragraph about the auction. 1 paragraph about Vivian's work at Hargrove. 1 paragraph about my company, and the quote from Vivian, exactly as she had said it, that she was very much in love with her wife, and made no apologies for making that visible. The piece ran with a still from the video. Vivian, in the ballroom light, halfway across the floor, the paddle in her hand, her face not quite smiling and more visible than a smile. I read it at my desk, and then I called Diane. Diane said, "The Mercy Children's Foundation is going to have its best fundraising year on record." I said, "I believe that." She said, "And Nadia, are you okay?" I said, "I think we are trying to be." She said, "That is the right answer." The weeks that followed were not easy. I would not describe them as easy, because describing them as easy would be dishonest. What they were was real. Vivienne and I were rebuilding something that had been standing for 20 months, but that needed the foundation properly examined. And examining a foundation while you are still living in the house is complicated. Sometimes you find things you thought were solid and they are not. There were nights when she went quiet in the way she always had. And I said, without softening it, "You are managing something. Tell me what." And she would look at me with the expression of someone doing a thing that did not come naturally, and she would tell me. Not fluently, not with the precision she brought to medical problems, in the halting, imprecise language of someone learning a skill they had decided for many years they did not need. She told me more about Joanna, not with bitterness. She was clear about that, and I believed her, but with the specificity of someone who had been carrying a thing for 7 years and had decided the carrying was no longer the right assignment. She told me she had understood, standing in the elevator, looking at the button for our floor on the night of the gala, that the structure she had built after Joanna was not protecting her from anything. It was simply a different way of not living the life she had. I told her that I had known something was wrong for most of the 10 months, but that I had decided, around month 3, not to force the conversation, because I was afraid that forcing it might reveal a truth I was not ready to hear, that the distance might not be fear, that the distance might be what she actually wanted from me. She looked at me when I said this, with an expression I did not have a name for, something between grief and recognition. She said, "I did not know you were afraid of that." I said, "You were not available to tell." She said, "No, I was not." She said, "I'm sorry." And then she named it specifically, not a general apology, a specific one, the naming of the particular thing that had been done and what it had cost. She said it on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the gala. I was in my home office working on a low-stakes project when she appeared in the doorway. No phone, no tablet, no professional reason to be there. Just standing in the doorway in jeans and a white shirt with her hair down. I said, "You can come in." She came in. She sat in the chair by the east window, the chair where Lena sometimes sat when we worked together late. She folded her legs and looked out the window at the morning. I went back to my work. We stayed like that for nearly an hour. Neither of us said anything. At some point she said, "What are you working on?" I described the problem. A large outdoor corporate event with a venue that had 3 distinct transition zones, and I needed each one to feel like a continuation of the evening, not a new event. She listened. She asked one precise question, and the question was actually useful in the way that questions from people who are genuinely thinking about your problem are useful. I said, "How do you know to ask that?" She said, "I have been listening to you talk about events for 20 months. I said, "And you retained it." She said, "I retain most things." I said, "I know." The morning light came through the east window, and the work was on the desk, and the apartment was the way apartments are on Saturday mornings, slightly quieter, more itself. She sat in the chair, and I worked, and the quality of the silence was the kind that had cost us nearly a year to get back to. Hargrove Medical Center's board had asked Vivienne to consider leading a new hospital partnership initiative that would require significant travel and a possible short-term relocation to another city for the better part of a year. Priya told me this on a Wednesday, not as gossip, as information she believed I should have. I waited. Vivienne told me herself. That evening at the kitchen island, she said, "The board is asking me to consider leading the Northeast expansion. It would mean a lot of travel, possibly a temporary move." I said, "I know." She looked at me. I said, "Priya." She said, "Of course." I said, "What did you tell them?" She said, "I told them I would give them an answer by end of month." I said, "What is the answer?" She looked at the counter, then at me. She said, "I am trying to decide whether the version of me that would have said yes without thinking twice is a version I should still be listening to." I said, "Walk me through that." She said, "For most of my career, I organized my decisions around the work and my role in it. When professional and personal competed, I had a default. This expansion would be that default, she said. A year ago, I would have said yes before you finished describing the role, I said. And now, she said, now I am aware that I spent 10 months using professional structure to manage a personal situation. And the management was wrong. And I am trying to develop better judgment about when professional structure is the right tool and when it is not. I said, this expansion is not the same thing as the 10 months. She said, I know that. What I am trying to determine is whether my instinct to accept is coming from the actual merits of the opportunity or from a much older habit. I looked at her. This precise, careful, brilliant woman examining her own defaults with the same rigor she brought to everything, doing it imperfectly, in the halting way that new skills always go. But doing it, I said, what do you want? Not what the hospital needs, and not what the role offers, and not what the version of you from 5 years ago would have decided. What do you want? A long silence. She said, I want to stay. I said, then tell the board, she said. It may create complications with the timeline. I said, Vivienne. She said, yes. I said, tell the board. She told them on Friday. She would oversee the expansion from headquarters through a strong regional team structure. She was not available for relocation. Priya texted me that afternoon. She said, she came out of the board meeting looking more like herself than she has in a long time. I wrote back, what does that mean? Priya wrote, it means she stopped making the decision that costs her the least and made the decision that was actually correct. The following Saturday, I was working late at my home office. A logistical detail that had been resisting me for 3 days finally clicked into place at 9:20 p.m. When it clicks into place, you know it immediately. It is unmistakable. I sat back and looked at it for a few minutes. She texted at 9:30. Are you still in the office? I wrote, yes, just finished something. She wrote, I'll come. I wrote, you don't have to. She wrote, I know. She arrived at 9:50 in a dark coat over jeans, hair down, nothing professional anywhere about her. She walked in and looked at the work on my desk. She said, that's right. I said, yes, just now. She said, I can tell. You have an expression you make when something resolves correctly. I said, I have an expression for that? She said, you have had it since that first morning in my office. When you described how you would transform the hospital's cocktail hour into something the guests would feel instead of just experience, you made that exact expression. I stared at her. She said, I told you I retain most things. The office was quiet around us. The city outside was at its late Saturday sound, reduced and honest. The version of itself that existed when the performance of the week was finally over. She was in her dark coat in my office looking at me with the full beam on. I said, you have been cataloguing me, she said, since the first morning. I said, that is a very long time. She said, yes. I said, before the dinners. She said, well, before the dinners. I said, before the parking garage. She said, considerably before the parking garage. I looked at her. This woman who had walked into my office meeting in a sunlit building with the morning behind her and had apparently, in some portion of her extraordinarily organized and controlled self, never fully left. I said, Vivienne. She said, yes. I said, come here. She crossed the distance between us. She was close enough that I could see everything, the small line between her brows that appeared when she was thinking hard, the specific gray of her eyes in the lamplight, the one loose piece at her right ear that the cold air outside had worked free. I reached up and touched the side of her jaw, the specific warmth of her face, at the edge of it, the hinge of it. I had traced that jaw in my memory for 20 months. She went completely still, not afraid, the correct kind of still. The kind that comes when something you have been managing for a very long time has finally arrived and you are feeling the full weight of its arrival. I said, I am still angry about the 10 months. She said, I know. I said, I am also exactly where I want to be. She said, yes. I held her gaze for one long moment. The lamp was on. The work was on the desk. Everything that had brought us here was present in the room, in the warm light. Then I stepped back. not because I wanted the distance, because some things need to arrive in the right place at the right time. And I had learned at real cost the difference between a moment that was ready and one that only looked ready. I did not intend to get that wrong again. She looked at me when I stepped back with a look I recognized, the satisfaction look, but quieter, more internal. Studying the decision I had just made, she said, I have been thinking about something since November. I said, since the board dinner, she said, since Marcus Reed stood beside you at that drinks table, and I was across the room. I said, you could have said something then. She said, I know. I am working on the version of myself that does things when they are right instead of when they are finally unavoidable. I said, how is that version coming? She said slowly, but I believe it is coming. I turned off the desk lamp, and we went home together in the cold spring night. Two women walking close, but not performing closeness. The natural proximity of people who have been moving through the same spaces together for a long time. Nothing to announce, except that it was different, and we both knew it was different, and neither of us needed to say so. The following Thursday, we had dinner at a restaurant. Vivienne had been wanting to try for months, the kind of place neither of us had gotten to, because there was always something more convenient. She had made the reservation. As we sat down, she mentioned she had made it 3 weeks ago. I said, 3 weeks ago. She said, the morning after the office. I said, you planned 3 weeks out while we were still in the middle of everything. She said, the conversation was going in the direction of Thursday dinner. I was confident in the trajectory, I said. The confidence of Vivienne Cole, she said. The confidence of a woman who catalogued you from a first meeting and married you 9 months after a Tuesday evening in a parking garage, and is not generally wrong about trajectories. I looked at her across the restaurant table, in her dark jacket and the grey blouse, and her hair for the evening still controlled, but with that same slightly loosened quality it had taken on since the spring. Like she had decided the controlled configuration did not need to be perfect. I said, are we on a date? She said. I said, you could have said that when you made the reservation, she said. I preferred to tell you now, when you could see my face. I held that. She said, I have something I need to say for the record. I said, what? She said, the work is not finished. I know the work is not finished. What happened over these 10 months is not resolved by one good spring. I know this, I said. I know you know, she said. I am telling you that I intend to do the actual work, not the version where I decide privately that I have figured it out and come back to you, having resolved it alone, the version where you can see what I am doing while I am doing it. I said, the actual version, she said. The actual version. That is what you asked for, and that is what I am telling you you are going to get. We had dinner for 2 hours. The food was right. She had, of course, researched the place carefully, and the conversation was the kind that only happens when two people have been through something real together and are genuinely on the other side of it and can see both the damage and the distance they have traveled. We walked out into the spring night, not cold anymore. The city had crossed some threshold while we were inside, and the air had the particular softness of a season finally arriving. She held the door. On the pavement outside, she stood with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at me with the composed face that was real, and the thing beneath it that she had stopped pretending was not there. I said, the actual version? She said, the actual version. I took her hand. We walked. No particular direction, no professional reason. Just the city in spring and two women with the specific quality of time that comes after difficult things. Not relief exactly, and not resolution, something adjacent to both. The feeling of a conversation that has been trying to happen for 20 months, finally finding the language it needed. She was still the most controlled person I had ever met. She was still going to go quiet sometimes when the thing she was managing got too heavy, and I was going to have to say, tell me, and she was going to tell me imperfectly, in the halting language of someone practicing a skill, They resisted for a long time, and I was going to receive it without making it smaller than it was. That was the work, not the auction, and not the paddle, and not the word mine, set against my hair in a room full of witnesses. Those were the moment the management stopped. The work was this: two people in a city in spring, choosing the actual version over the constructed one night at a time. She said, "The Mercy Children's Gala next year. Diane has already asked me if I will sponsor the lead table." I said, "Of course she has," she said. "I told her yes." A pause. "I also told her I would match whatever the experience auction raises." I looked at her. She said, "It seemed like the right thing to do for the foundation." I said, "It had nothing to do with the foundation." The corner of her mouth moved, 1 millimeter. I had 20 months of cataloging material. I knew every version of that corner. I stopped walking. She stopped beside me. The city moved around us, and the spring air was soft, and the streetlight was doing something useful to the space between us. I said, "Vivienne," she said. "Yes." I took her face in both hands, the specific warmth of her jaw, the same hinge, the same face I had reached for in the office, and then stepped back from when the timing was not right. She was very still, the correct kind of still. I kissed her on the pavement in the middle of the spring night, while the city went past us without caring at all, which was exactly the right amount of witness. Not a ballroom full of 200 people and a $25,000 paddle, just two women on a pavement. Finally finished managing the distance between them. When I stepped back, she looked at me with the private smile, the real one. The one that appeared when she had done something she considered correct and was feeling the full, quiet satisfaction of being right. She said the trajectory was always correct. I said, "You are insufferable when you are right." She said, "I am frequently right." I said, "I know." I catalogued it. "Extensively?" I said, 20 months. I have had considerable material." She said, "Good." We walked home. She held my hand in the spring dark, and neither of us filled the silence, because the silence did not need filling. It was the old kind, the inhabited kind, the kind from the first months before the management, the kind that was not empty but full, full of the specific weight of two people who had been through a real thing together and were now on the other side of it. Both hands open,